Okay. Hello, everyone that is just starting to join us on our stream. I'm going to share my screen really quick to do a little intro for the stream that we're doing today. We have Zoe Bennett here with us. She is the author of The Son of God, which is a new book. We'll explain more about in a minute. I do have the QR code on the screen for the book. You can see what it looks like there. So as usual, let my computer be slow, but what is SASA? SASA stands for Save Ancient Studies Alliance. We work to promote the study of the ancient world and engagement with our human deeper past, building a grassroots movement through outreach, collaboration, accessibility, and public scholarship. We work towards our goal of inspiring a wide, inclusive community of scholars, learners, and students. So we do this in many ways. One of them is our Port Ancient Gallery, which is what Zoe and her book is part of, our partnership gallery. So definitely check out our amazing partners. We have a ton of them. We also do live streams basically every week, whether they're master classes or Archeo Gaming. We have an open access database with lots of searchable research materials. And last but not least, our virtual conference is at the end of July on the 21st and 22nd. It's a free live stream virtual conference with like 20 different research projects being presented. So please do come check that out. Where to find SASA, you can search Save Ancient Studies Alliance on basically any platform. Please do like, follow, subscribe our pages. It really makes a huge difference. Having this following, that's really our ultimate goal, is to spread the word about ancient studies and how you can learn about it. We post on our social media platforms basically every day. So lots of content to see there. Just some protocol for the event. Please be kind and respectful. Listen and ask thoughtful questions. On each of the platforms where you might be viewing this, there is a chat feature. So when you send your questions into the chat, we will see them and we can answer your questions and read your thoughts. These streams are recorded and saved on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook. So you can find them later there and share them with your friends if you want. And last but not least, if you like what you see from SASA, we are a pretty small grassroots NGO, so really any size donation helps. Pretty much the only funding we have is through grants for specific projects. You can become a recurring supporter for as little as $3 a month or make a one-time donation. We also have a bookshop and a bazaar where we sell ancient-themed merchandise and a few other ways to donate, so please do go check that out. So with that, thank you very much all for joining us. I will turn off my PowerPoint here. And to get started, let me resize this a little bit. There we go. I will just kind of hand it over to Zoe to introduce herself and her wonderful book. So hi, Zoe.
Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Zoe Bennett. I wrote The Son of God. I'm a recent classics major. I graduated from Williams College with a classics degree. And I just wanted to write a story that brought the ancient world that I was studying alive. And so this project sort of came about from that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for coming on with us. I will put the QR code on the screen again later for anyone that might have missed it, or it should. I think it sends the link in the comments too when we put it on the screen. So you can check the comments and it might be there. So to dive into this about Zoe's book, which I will mention, Zoe also has like a website and a newsletter and is on TikTok. So go and find her and follow her in all of those places. But about the book, so like, what inspired you to write this book, to write in general? I actually also have a degree in classical civilizations, and I am very far from being a writer. So it's interesting to me, like, how like that inspired you to write about this. Were you always, have you written other things and stuff like that? Like, how did you get started with this book?
Yeah, I mean, I have always been writing for as long as I can remember, but I never really tried my hand at historical fiction until now. I had done some like teen fiction and romance, and this idea came about when I was studying abroad in my junior year in Rome at the Centro. Shout out to my fellow classmates who I know some of you are watching. In our ancient Greek class, we were reading the Res Gestae, which is Emperor Augustus's great work, if you can call it that, about his life the year before he dies, or the year he dies. And it's a sort of a stale document, but we read the Greek translation from Latin. And for some reason, learning about this 19-year-old Octavius, who sort of came out of nowhere after Julius Caesar was assassinated, took power, it just fascinated me because I was just turning 21 and I couldn't imagine, doing something like this. So yeah, so I was like, I need to get to the bottom of who this guy is. Like, what was his life like? What was he like? What were these other people? Because in his life, my book has multiple perspectives. It has Octavius, Agrippa, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, Attica, Octavia, Livia, like everyone you can think of. Even Cicero, Brutus, and Cassius and Sextus get their moment to shine. So I was really trying to understand this time period and these people as individuals. And the only way I felt like you could really do that was through storytelling.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that because I constantly think about that. I'm like, how are all these people? Like Cleopatra was really young. Mark Antony was pretty young too. And you mentioned Greek stuff. Like obviously Alexander the Great was famously really young. And it's just crazy. I'm 31 years old and I'm like, yeah, I haven't taken over half the world yet. So
I haven't bribed the Senate for the consulship yet.
Right, exactly. And honestly, it's that would be, it's just such an interesting thing. It's not something that 19-year-olds do anymore, but it was something that Octavian had this access to and was smart enough. Obviously he was a genius, and whether that was a good thing or a bad thing can be debated back and forth quite a bit, and is all the time. But it's just so interesting that he had this cunning and intuition of how to accomplish this at such a young age. So I love that that's what was part of it for you, because you were 20, 21 too. And also it was interesting, you said that you were reading the Greek translation from the Latin, but you were studying in Italy. Just curious, why was it the Greek translation?
So I had Latin and Greek while I was there. Latin, we were reading the younger Pliny's letters. And then in Greek, our Greek professor was like, I haven't really done this one before. I'm not sure how this is going to go because it's the Res Gestae. It's not one of those texts that you think of when you think of the classical world as worth reading. But we read it in Greek because the translation changes. So this Greek text was found in Ankara in Turkey, modern day Turkey. And the Greek translator purposely changed some things in the Latin that maybe wouldn't have gone down so well in a province of theirs, we came and we conquered. That's not going to go down well with the people they conquered. So they purposely changed some things to be a little bit kinder, about him taking over. And in that way, it was actually really interesting because that's propaganda at work. So
right,
So part of the reason writing Augustus was so interesting and so difficult was because he had so much propaganda surrounding him at his time. He did it purposefully to be very secretive and private, and his image, he wanted to portray himself a certain way. But then century after century, the historians and the propaganda of the Roman Empire afterward, it just layer after layer of propaganda that you just don't know what's real or not. So in writing his character, you try to brush all that aside and get to him as a person. And he's
exactly.
Who knows?
Exactly. But that is cool. I feel that was a little spark for you reading it in Greek instead of in Latin, because it's bringing to light super directly these changes that were made for the audience that's watching it. And obviously you have to take your audience into consideration of who are reading it. Sorry, I said watching it. But and how you're portraying Augustus and what angle you want to take. Obviously, there's probably an emperor and about him being this power figure and stuff. But I like how you mentioned a lot of it was propaganda to be hiding what he really had going on, if for lack of a better way to say it. So that's really interesting. I love that. Okay, so beyond that, what do you think was your favorite part about writing the book? And I guess like second question of that was, what was the hardest or most challenging part about writing the book?
I think the most fun I had was sort of being a detective about it and researching the timeline. You're trying to piece together, when did people get married? When did they die? When did this political event happen? When did this battle happen? And you would think it would be easy, but when you're working with ancient historical sources that often even contradict each other or are making up lies or all that kind of stuff, or is lost. We don't even know when someone dies or when this happens, exactly what town. But when you're writing a story, you need to know what town it happened in. You have to know, like, when do these people get married? Because you can't just gloss over a marriage or children, just like you can't gloss over a political battle or a political event. You can't just gloss over the relationships that people have. So it was so fun, keeping the historical events accurate, how I had to weave the relationships and the tension and all this stuff throughout those historical events. So I think that was the most fun for me. And I think that opened up a lot of the female perspectives that you don't really hear about. I mean, you hear about Attica, Agrippa's wife, but you don't really even know how she died or if she died, when she died.
Yeah.
So some of that I have obviously had to take some, liberties with, but that was sort of the fun part, the detective part.
Right, right. No, I totally agree. And a lot of the books that we have on for book clubs and stuff like that have this like aspect of like having the point of view from the women that's like really hard to find actual historical evidence of that, because even the stuff that you do find, it's probably written by a man 200 years after this woman was even alive. So there's always agendas and biases going into everything. Like, it's completely unavoidable, but it gives you that space to like kind of like add your own storytelling into it, like you said, to add like the tension and the drama and whatever that was for sure happening. In case you guys don't know, the Roman Empire was absolutely chock full of drama. So that's great. And I love Livia. So I hope that she plays a role in your book too.
Oh, she does.
Another genius. Oh boy, was she quite the lady. So I would love to see your portrayal of her, because there's lots of portrayals of her too, and some show her in a better light or a worse light, but you can't get away from the fact that she is very smart as well.
I think that like ties into some of the difficulties. Like the biggest challenge I had in writing it was getting past all of the, especially like popular media nowadays, that how they portray these characters, because it is such a talked about time. And then also the ancient historians and how they portrayed, especially Livia, Augustus, Mark Antony, Cleopatra, like these big names. I mean, Shakespeare, like, tried his hand at it. So you're combating all of these sort of entrenched portrayals of them and how people understand, it's like, who is Cleopatra or Mark Antony? Like, how can you get past Emperor Augustus's character? Was he really ruthless? Was he charming? How do you, square those two kinds of sides to his personality? Because he's, he brings in this age of peace, but he also murdered a lot of people to get there. So it's a complicated time. And so trying to get past all of that, how we think of these people, and trying to get to their individuality, like what were their fears? What were their hopes? What were their relationships like? Like, I think in telling a story, I was really focusing on their relationships with each other, because they did have them. So, and when you're learning in history class, you don't always talk about, well, what was, Octavia and Mark Antony, for example, they got married and they had 2 kids. It's not very talked about, but can you imagine being married to Mark Antony, having 2 kids with him? Like, I don't know if it's because I'm a woman, I'm like, thinking about that, I was like, oh God, like, I don't know how I would handle it if I were Octavia in that moment. And it was a political marriage too. So there's that element thrown in. Who does she have loyalty to, her brother or her husband and her kids? So it gets complex when you're writing a story and you have to go into Octavia's mind and write her perspective about it. You can't just brush aside all of this. So that was very hard to write.
Yeah. No, I can totally see that. And I'm trying to think of how to frame this question right, but it's kind of about like, so, because of the way that people usually learn about history, it is much more this like straight facts kind of thing. And of course, learning about the biases and whatever. but it's like, again, I'm not a writer, so I can't even like, how do you even start to contextualize how you're like putting these like more individual emotions on people, especially because you have a degree in classics and stuff, so you're like very well versed with learning about it in an academic setting. Um, and then like, right, making them into real people. Like, how do you get people to step away from what they already know about Augustus and the Roman Empire to try to see him as a real person like that?
Oof, yeah, I mean, that was hard. And I feel like my first draft, I struggled with that the most. And in my second draft, I really tried to dig deeper to paint a better picture of like his individuality, because he is such a contradicting character. Like, he has this kind of ruthless, almost psychopathic qualities to him, where he can like, mass murder and all this stuff, and kill people like Cicero, who were sort of on his side for a while. But then he's also building a lot. He does a lot of reforms. He's very traditional. He's, brings in this age of peace, and he's sort of willing to have that peace at all costs, but also he is a dictator, and there's certain realities like that that you can't escape when you're writing. But something I did do that is not historically backed, but I think helped me get in touch with his sort of complex personality, was his relationship with Agrippa. Agrippa was his, closest friend from childhood, early childhood. They went to Apollonia together. They trained for war together. And he was like his best general. Like, if you read anything about him, like his history describes him as, his comrade in arms, a genius tactician. He was just, this brilliant man, but he was steadfastly loyal to Augustus. And it's really emphasized that he never tried to take power. And if you read any of the history that happens with the rest of the emperors, like, there's betrayals left and right, but Agrippa remained loyal to him. And so I was trying to tease out Augustus's character through that sort of complicated emotional relationship with someone who's loyal to you, but at the same time, you're trying to take absolute power. And I made it a little bit complicated, and maybe more complicated than we would understand it today. Just,
Yeah.
It's like, it's hard because he is such a complex character, but I did focus also on his relationship with Livia, who they say he fell in love with, and trying to understand. I do have a little twist in that of how they got married that is a little bit of my own invention, but I felt like it served the story well and doesn't change any historical facts.
And honestly, I mean, what do we know about their marriage that's not just purely parts of political propaganda? So who knows what really happened there? And I'm glad you brought up his relationship with Agrippa, because I've always wondered about that too. Like, how much of this is this political propaganda that's trying to be like, look how loyal he is, and like, look at this high status he has because he's so loyal to me. Like, if you're loyal to me like this, then you can be like Agrippa and whatever. Because it is like absolutely wild that he never tried to take power. Like, there's like 800,000 times that he could have just like killed Octavian and taken power, or,
especially
whatever.
with how good he was like in militarily, like he could just, and he was really building a lot in the city. He was doing a lot of things that were good and people loved him, but he never did. And I sort of parallel that relationship with Mark Antony and Cleopatra, who, Mark Antony is trying to take power, and Cleopatra too. And they are sort of, it seems, trying to use each other to become a sort of king and queen of a new empire that would have its capital in the East. And, they both end up losing. They're on the losing side, and they commit suicide together. And I sort of thought, for Mark Antony to cast all of his, lots with Cleopatra, and risk that loss, when there were times when he could have pulled out. He could have, said, okay, I'm not going to do this. I'm going to try to just gain power in Rome. And he doesn't really do that. So I felt like he wasn't willing to risk as much as Octavian was willing to risk in his relationships. Like, I think Octavian was willing to cast aside a lot more people than Mark Antony. And I really wanted that to be a kind of parallel throughout the story. And you get it really at the end when, I don't want to this is all history, but, I don't want to spoil the ending, how the story ends, but spoiler, doesn't go well for Cleopatra and Mark Antony.
Yeah. No, and Mark Antony too is such an interesting one because it's one that goes so back and forth with how they portray Mark Antony and Cleopatra's relationship between like, oh, he was actually so in love with her that's why he like chose her and Egypt over Rome and whatever. But it's like, okay, it also could have been because it's similar things to how they talk about Alexander the Great. Like he was so obsessed with Egypt and he like changed his empire in these certain ways that were really focusing a lot of stuff on Egypt. And that's where he like got his oracle about him getting this power and whatever. And then, obviously she's like descended from this line that he put in power. And then like, I don't know, have had children with her. So, it's easy to look at her and be like, okay, she's clearly like using this for political gain. But then all this stuff that happens with her and Mark Antony is so different than what happens with her and Caesar. Do you touch on her relationship with Caesar at all, or it's more focusing on her?
I do because I make a little bit of a parallel between Mark Antony and Julius Caesar. Mark Antony is sort of always in the shadow of Julius Caesar. It seems he's trying to take over the same power that he had, but he never quite does it. So I have this idea of his character as, trying to do somewhat of the same things that Julius Caesar does, but better. And then he finds himself in a siege in Alexandria, which is exactly where Julius Caesar found himself with Cleopatra when they had their kid. So he finds himself sort of in the same like spaces with the same woman. And he's wondering how his end is going to be different. But it's clear that they definitely I believe they had strong feelings for each other, but I do touch upon like they're in love with each other. They are husband and wife. They get married. They have kids, a lot of kids together. But they're also, Queen of Egypt and this Roman general, one of the triumvirate, who's trying to take power in Rome. And so I think it was really fun, actually. And one of my favorite scenes that I wrote was an argument they have sort of on the eve of their deaths, where they're both battling these two sides of themselves. They're at once rulers. They want to have power, but they also love each other. And it's so hard for them to like deal with both sides of themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's just their relationship absolutely fascinates me. And then obviously unavoidably coming into play is these other people like Octavian and whatever during this time. And then you like, if you're interested in it, it's like you have to look at their relationships too, like their relationship with each other and then what Octavian has going on and whatever. So it really sounds like your book does a very interesting way of kind of contextualizing the stuff that was going on, like these huge, like turns in historical events that were happening at this time with this like relatively small group of people. Although of course there were so many more people involved than we will even ever know about. And like all these armies that are super dedicated to each of these generals of the triumvirate and stuff like that. So yeah. And then even more mind blowing what's going on with Octavian, because he was this 19-year-old that like wasn't exactly part of that. And like not even Caesar's real son. And like, but again, it's like that was acceptable in Rome for Caesar to just adopt him as his son. And now that's real. So, okay, cool. Like, so, and who knows what exactly really went on with that between him and Octavian too. And all the drama with, do you talk about people's wills in the book? Because that's another thing I absolutely love from this time period is who's really writing wills? And who's like killing each other to write their fake will?
There's 2 points. So obviously Julius Caesar's will is a huge deal. And Mark Antony actually reads it in front of like, the entirety of Rome and is like, his son is now adopted son is Gaius Octavius. But Octavius is not in Rome at the time. So Mark Antony's like, okay, well then I'm going to take over. And so that's a big point. And then there's also Mark Antony's will and what he says. And actually that will works against him. And Octavius definitely uses it to garner support in Rome by saying, look at this guy. Like he wants to be buried in Egypt. Like he wants to be buried with this Egyptian queen. He's a foreigner. Like his home is not Rome anymore. He wants to make this, an Egyptian empire, whatever, Eastern empire. And so he definitely used that will to his advantage. So, and then obviously at the very end, I sort of touch upon Augustus writing his own will and the tension between him and Livia, because obviously Augustus had different heirs in mind for who was going to take over, and they all die. And so he's sort of left with Tiberius, who is Livia's biological son, who he doesn't like. It's very clear. If you read the will, it's actually embarrassing that this was read aloud and Tiberius, like, you know, is totally trashed in the beginning. So wills definitely play a huge part.
Right, exactly. And I've just always wondered, like you said, the thing with Mark Antony's will, it's like, was this really his will? Was this really what he wrote about, like, being buried in Egypt and stuff? Or was Octavian like, okay, cool, he died, so now I can make it look like he wanted to, like, it's one of those things that's so hard to get a sense of how they really verified this kind of stuff. Because even now, with all the technology we have and all this stuff, it's hard to verify who did something. And like, so I've always thought about that about ancient history. Like, anyone could be doing anything.
Well, the funny you say that about that will, because Mark Antony's will, basically there was people who, you know, there's people who witness it. And one of those witnesses was Plancus. And he basically switches sides last minute and goes to Octavius and says, I witnessed that will. I know what was in it. Here are the things that were in it. And so it's basically his word against everyone else, against Mark Antony's word. But there is speculation by later historians that maybe that will was forged by Octavius, which of course no one would put past him. So I do have this conversation between him and Livia when they're talking about, you know, maybe they're trying to scheme together, which I love those. They have these scheming moments. You know, how can we bring Mark Antony down? And they're like, what can really nail in the coffin for him? And, you know, I have Livia sort of suggest, well, maybe it's something like a document of something that we can use against him. And he's like, you know, what could it be? And she's like, maybe a will of some kind. And he's like, you know, how that might be stored with the Vestal Virgins, because that's usually where wills were stored. And it's like, you can't go just take out some random person's will, because he was still alive. So you can't do that. So then Livia's like, well, maybe like it can be forged. She sort of implies that maybe they could forge it, but I never have it known fully if that happens or not, because that is sort of, and sometimes I do that where I leave things a little open-ended where you don't know 100%, because in history you don't. And so I leave some things a little bit in the dark to be a little more mysterious about it.
Right. No, exactly. Because that really is like how it is. Like, people who study history, it's a lot of piecing things together to try to get the most viable possible conclusion, but you're never really going to know. Like, there's basically no chance to know anything 100%. From ancient history. And again, it's like, oh, the most powerful person in the world was trying to cover this up. Do you think they were probably successful of covering it up? Probably. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question in the chat. Well, we have a few questions in the chat, so you can scroll through them, but I'm going to put one on screen in particular. This is from Grace. She said, I have a question for Zoe. Which character's perspective was your favorite to write about, and why?
Oof, that's such a hard question, because, you know, you sort of come to love like all these people, even when they're sort of bad and they don't do things very nicely. You know, you're like trying to empathize with them in order to write their mind, because if you can't empathize with them, you're not really going to understand them as people. I think the perspective I had the most fun with was, and this might come as a surprise, I'm not sure, but Mark Antony, because he is such a big, like, historical figure. You know, he takes up a lot of space. He was called, you know, a barbarian. He was apparently really, you know, he was probably maybe an alcoholic, they say, like, you know, all this kind of stuff, bad things about him. So I think I had a lot of fun with his sort of gray characteristics. You know, yeah, he probably was a drunk if they're calling him that. You know, he was pretty manly, like, you know, I think Cicero calls him a gladiator, which I think is hilarious. So, and then he has this affair with Cleopatra. He has so many kids. So I sort of thought, you know, maybe he's charming with women. I don't know, you know, or he's aggressive. These questions come into mind. And so it was fun to tease out his personality, because I felt like he had a really big personality. So getting his dialogue, how he interacted with people, it was just sort of fun to play around with that.
Mm-hmm. Yes, no, I totally agree. And okay, one of the next questions was, well, Mark Antony was married to Octavia before Cleopatra, wasn't he? And yes, he was. So
by marriage laws, he was. he was married first to Octavia was through a sort of like, it was basically the way I interpret it, and a sort of the way I put it into, the story is that Octavian maybe wanted Octavia to keep an eye on Mark Antony while he was already going over to Egypt a lot, already had an affair with Cleopatra. That was already going. So here, I think he even already had kids with Cleopatra, I think. I'd have to check my timeline again on that one. But he was already like in a full affair with Cleopatra when he was sort of forced to marry Octavia because, they're in this, the triumvirate was already falling apart and they were trying to keep it sort of glued together. And then he, at one point, Mark Antony goes back to Egypt with and maybe actually Antioch. That's one of the other cities they spent a lot of time in the East. And Octavius sends his sister Octavia to go meet with him and send him some aid because he had asked for aid. And she reaches Athens when, news arrives from Mark Antony, and he says, don't come any further. Like, I don't want your aid. I don't want anything. Like, basically, this marriage is over. Like, go back to Rome. Like, you're not going to be safe if you come near me. Like, this is over. And then he marries Cleopatra. So he chooses a side at that point. But yes, he did have 2 kids with Octavia. And I do throw in, that's like a kind of wrench in his relationship with Cleopatra, sort of, side, like, you're having, this is your Roman wife, because if he stayed with Octavia and maybe relinquished a little power to Octavius, maybe he would have been still alive. Who knows? Octavius could have felt, merciful.
Right. I love how you said timeline too, because it's just, first of all, they're traveling back and forth so much, and it takes like forever to get there. It's not like a plane ride away, and they're like millionaires that can just fly whenever they want in a private jet. Like, it takes time, and like, if you're going to eat, it's like, oh, I'm gonna skip over there today.
Yeah.
Married to Octavia, he for sure at least had 1 kid with Cleopatra. And yeah, it's just you're pregnant for 9 months. Like you said, he has like all these kids. Like, that's this whole span of time of having all these kids. And you're pregnant for 9 months. Like, sometimes it seems like, oh, like this is like a few months, they had these battles, this is whatever, Octavian won, but it was like so much stuff leading up to the result that came from this, I think that Octavian, like, a lot of his political platform was like piety and like extreme, I'm totally blanking on the right word, but like being dedicated to Rome, and whatever. So it was just like, was that really what his first thoughts were on wanting to like have that propaganda campaign like that? Or was he like, oh, like, check this, look at Mark Antony going to Egypt all the time, so I can be like, oh, I'm the true Roman, and he's like trying to Egyptianize us and whatever, it's just like, it's so interesting to think about the different ways things could have gone. Like, what if Mark Antony would have fallen in love with some Greek woman and he was going to Greece all the time? Like, it would just be totally different history of what happened from little stuff like that. And so, okay, someone else in the chat, Christoph, said, Cicero, here, let me pull it up. Cicero called Mark Antony a man with a gladiator's body who is drinking too much. That's
there wonderful. It
is. Exactly something that Cicero would say.
Exactly. Yeah, Cicero's good with his words. He knew how to wield the pen against his opponents. And he notoriously did not like Mark Antony at all.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I like what you said about the timeline, because it's like pregnancy is 9 months, and then children get born and they grow older. So you have to keep track of all that. And then marriages happen, and then people are traveling, it took them 3 months or, how many weeks to get from one place to another. And in my book, each, like, a chapter can have like 3 sections with 3 different times. It might be like, March 44, but then it might go like, November 44. And sometimes I pass over quite a bit of time because my book encompasses from 44 BC to 31 BC. So it's quite a bit of time that passes. Actually, I think it starts 43 BC, even a year before the assassination, and then 31. So at times I have to jump a lot of time. And then when I first wrote the first draft, I would write sometimes a scene, of someone getting married or something. And then I'll start writing the next person's perspective later. And I'm like, wait, but now what I'm describing happened before the other chapter.
Yeah.
And so I would have to go and change and decide what I was actually going to spend time highlighting and what I felt would really, the core events that really would weave together the story.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. I love, timeline stuff is just so interesting to me. Again, with ancient history, it's like we have all these little snippets of things that we're trying to put together, and it's easy to think that it happened pretty fast, but really most of this stuff is happening over years, decades, multiple generations of people.
And they live it day by day. They go day by day, which is something
exactly.
we forget.
I was just going to say they had 24 hours just like the rest of us.
Yeah.
They had to sit through every single day. So I love that. Okay. I am going to bring the QR code up again. So please do scan the QR code on the side of the screen over here to grab your copy of The Son of God. Zoe, do you have any last thoughts or any last spiel about your book that you want to give?
I'm just thankful that I was able to talk about it a little today. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, I hope people enjoy it. It's a little bit of a, hefty book, but I think it's really goes deep into the characters and, makes you think about history and brings us closer to the history, which I think is really needed now to, because history teaches us lessons. And so, you got to know your history.
Exactly. And that's what I love about historical fiction. It's like making these people real people, because they were real people. They were human beings just like we are, with a lot more power and money than we probably have. But, right. Definitely the me, but that's okay. So yes, also I will mention, we don't have a set date yet, but we will be doing an actual book club that is an hour-long stream with MJ Pankey, who runs our book clubs, with Zoe back on for The Son of God. So check out that. I'm sure we will both be advertising it on our channels. So check back for that in the next few weeks or months, where we can go in a little bit more of a deeper dive about some of these topics that we were talking about today. So thank you everyone so much for joining us. Thank you for your wonderful comments and stuff in the chat. Zoe, it was absolutely wonderful to chat with you. I'm looking forward to having you on again. And on that, we'll end the stream. Again, this is recorded, so you can find it on our YouTube channels and on Zoe's Instagram channel. And we will see you guys all next time.